Okay, welcome everyone to the final postgrad seminar of the semester. I'll begin by acknowledging that we meet and do our research and teaching at Parkville and South Bank campuses on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bomarong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. We acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. And so this is our final postgrad seminar of the year, and it's a completion seminar. We'll welcome Justeen Wheatley to speak for approximately 45 minutes. We'll then take a brief 5-minute pause, and then we'll have questions from her external respondent, Dr. Dylan Vanderscape, and her panel, Richard Kurth, Elliott Gyger, and Linda Kouvaras, and then we'll open up to the full seminar for questions. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Justeen.
Hi, my name is Justeen Wheatley, and my doctoral project is on the communication and organization of musical time through a notational device called odd-factored time signatures, commonly known by its misnomer, irrational time signatures. Just before we begin in proper, I'd really like to acknowledge my supervisory committee in attendance today. So a very big thank you to Professor Richard Kurth, who's my primary supervisor, my secondary supervisor, Professor Elliott Gyger, and the chair of my supervisory committee, Professor Linda Kouvaras, who's online. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for your expertise, your guidance, your support over these past 4 years, which have just presented countless challenges and difficulties, and the completion of this project really wouldn't have been possible without all of you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Also, I wanted to thank Associate Professor Dylan Vanderscape for being an external respondent. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I really look forward to anything you have to say. Finally, this is a little unorthodox, but I want to give glory and honor to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, because he gives me life and life to the fullest. And without him, I wouldn't have meaning, and I wouldn't be here today. So let's get into it.
In this completion seminar, I'll run through some fundamental definitions and conceptions, my research questions, and the research scope and methodology. I'll be looking at 2 different example pieces taken from chapters 5 and 7 of my thesis, just to showcase some of my research findings and applications. And I'll conclude with a few remarks about the limitations of the study and potential future avenues of research. So to start off, what is an odd-factored time signature? As a preliminary definition, odd-factored time signatures are time signatures where the denominator, so the bottom number, is not purely a power of 2. So it's not 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. So as in all the familiar traditional denominators. To include all other possible denominators, we need to consider all integers that have at least one odd number in their prime factorization. This includes all odd numbers, of course, but also many even numbers. So for example, the even denominator 6 is an odd-factored denominator because its prime factorization is 2 times 3, with the odd number, of course, being 3. Similarly, the even denominator 14 has the prime factorization of 2 times 7. The odd denominator 15 has 2 odd prime factors, 3 times 5, and so forth. Thank Richard Kurth for coining the term odd-factored time signatures to accurately define all possible denominators that are not a power of 2. The numerator continues to be any integer. With the current rhythmic notation system, you'll be familiar with a note tree, such as this, where the base note value is a semi-brief or a whole note. From there, it's halved into minims, which can be halved into crotchets, then quavers, semiquavers, etc. This halving process results in the automatic assumption that conventional time signature denominators would only be numbers that are powers of 2, as they correspond directly to those particular note values. But what if the semi-brief was divided in any other way besides halving? What if instead of being divided into 2, it was divided into 3? equal parts. That would equate to a triplet minim, beat or pulse, and so the denominator would be a 3. If the semibreve was divided into 5, it would be quintuplet crotchets. If the semibreve was divided into 6, it would be sextuplet or triplet crotchets. To put it another way, let's have a look at 2/4 bars as a simple example. I'll stomp on the downbeat and I'll clap the surface beats. So this minim bar duration could be split into 2 crotchets, or it could be split into 3 triplet crotchets. And then I can alternate these bars. So on the surface, you can feel these rhythmic changes. In another sense, you can also feel changes to the pulse speed as it transitions from straight crotchets to triplet crotchets. Now, what happens if I took out one of these triplet crotchets to make bars of only 2 triplet crotchets instead, as in like 2 6 bars? Several things start happening. So on the surface, notationally, you'll notice that 2 straight crotchets are contrasted against 2 triplet crotchets. So there's a difference rhythmically. What if I took out the stomp on the downbeats of each bar? So sonically, the first straight crotchet still falls at the same attack point where that final triplet crotchet used to be. So the second straight crotchet almost sounds like a rhythmic hiccup of sorts, and this introduces some rhythmic ambiguity, at least on the sonic level. Going from one bar to the next, since the note durations repeat, there's also an alternation of pulse speed from straight crotchet to triplet crotchet, kind of like a metric modulation where the tempo shifts from bar to bar. Furthermore, after hearing me clap 2/4 bars for so long, and then hearing this shift into alternating 2/4 and 2/6 bars, it feels like a distortion of the original 2/4 metric grid. And finally, the bar durations are also changed, where every alternating 2/4 bars shortened to become 2/6 bars. In other words, a 2/6 bar is 2/3 the length of a 2/4 bar. This establishes a 2-to-3 durational proportional relationship. And this 2-to-3 ratio could be renotated into conventional time signatures with metric modulation. However, there is a major disadvantage to this. Renotation will not be able to clearly or simply capture proportions which are more complex and less easily rationalizable than 2-to-3. I've come across proportions such as 7-to-11 or 15-to-16, which are just heinous to renotate in normal notational methods. And another thing to note is that although the 6-8-2-4 renotation with metric modulation is widely accepted, it presupposes the common smaller value of the quaver linking both time signatures, whereas the odd-factored time signature notation does not foreground these common smaller note values as structurally important. So through this simple change of the time signature denominator, so many aspects involving musical time are affected all at once. The rhythms, the tempi, the sensation and entrainment of meter, the bar lengths. Historically, there has been an assumption that time signatures and meter are synonymous, and although we should be considering meter as an important implication of time signatures, the specific uses of odd-factored time signatures make it apparent that there is a clear distinction between time signatures and meter. I make it a point to label this notational device as odd-factored time signatures, not odd-factored meters, because oftentimes they don't actually indicate meters. And we'll see this as we look at more examples later on. So from this 2-4, 2-6 example, I hope I've demonstrated that this notational device has the potential to inform multiple musical parameters, not just meter. They draw relationships, connections, and patterns that would enrich the compositional, performative, and auditory experience of post-tonal music. And in this post-metrical context where music contains frequently changing time signatures, or where the notational convenience is decoupled from the sonic perception, odd-factored time signatures no longer act as mere interlopers in the regular metric grid. Rather, they take on a more significant role in provoking and facilitating rhythmic and tempo complexities, and my project tries to explore these potential uses of odd-factored time signatures. Specifically, my project aims to answer the following research questions. What are the advantages of using odd-factored time signatures, and what are the circumstances which determine effective odd-factored time signature use? So answering these first two questions involves examination of the musical contexts in which odd-factored time signatures allow efficient notation, and also consideration of how the performer and listener are afforded a more accurate understanding of the manipulation of tempo and note grouping, depending on accentuation. With questions 3 and 4, in the music which employs odd-factored time signatures, how does the metrical notation reflect other aspects of the musical discourse? And why are odd-factored time signatures important in understanding the relationships between time-related musical parameters in a post-tonal context? Now, although I won't be going into too much detail in this completion seminar, in my thesis, I do explore how odd-factored time signatures are situated within the post-tonal oeuvre, how post-tonal composers conceptualize and interact with the different elements of musical time have repercussions for the connectivity, the interconnectivity of other parameters related to musical time. And finally, how do odd-factored time signatures help composers and performers grapple with and approach an understanding of musical time? And I think this is especially pertinent when much of the Western analytical discourse has been focused on pitch and harmony-related subjects instead. So in order to approach answering these research questions, I've shaped my project to include a brief introductory chapter, followed by a chapter on the theoretical underpinnings of odd-factored time signatures. This is where I set out the definitions of meter, pulse stream, periodicity, accent, all that jazz, as well as explain the historical progression leading to Henry Cowell's invention of odd-factored time signatures. My second chapter focuses on several interpretational ambiguities of the notational device. Because odd-factored time signatures are a modification of conventional notation, there are complexities which arise from the way these conventions are manipulated, and therefore they give rise to challenges which composers are required to solve in different ways. After chapter 2, I focus on a couple of composers, Thomas Adès and Brian Ferneyhough, and I dedicate 3 chapters to each composer. So firstly, to introduce the composer and give an overview of their works. Secondly, to look at a small case study, what I call a concentrated example. And thirdly, to thoroughly examine a larger case study piece in detail. And then I conclude my thesis. The methodology I've used stems from what interested me about this field of research in the first place. So back in my first year of my bachelor's, I was looking at composing a piece in 3/3. And when I approached Elliott Gyger, he said that it was not only possible, but that several composers had already beaten me to the punch, and then directed me to Thomas Adès. That led me to write my honours dissertation on the subject. But I felt like there was much more to explore, as there were greater implications to the uses of odd-factored time signatures than the ones I had previously identified. So I broadened my horizons to also include the works of Brian Ferneyhough. Now, I chose both composers because they're probably 2 of the most well-known composers who use odd-factored time signatures, and they're easy to compare as they're compositional contemporaries who originate from England. But ultimately, I chose Ferneyhough because his approach to using odd-factored time signatures seems diametrically opposed to Adès's. And I say seems diametrically opposed for a few reasons. Adès has been called a surrealist composer, a moniker by Richard Taruskin, which Adès has since embraced. He has a propensity for reinvention, and he's also a performer. He's often conducted or played the piano in the premieres of his works. So it's clear from how he writes his pieces that he favors clarity and simplicity in his notational style. And so it can be inferred that he has the performer in mind when composing. Ferneyhough, on the other hand, has been labeled as the father of new complexity, much to his chagrin, due to his deep modernist tendencies for formalization and notational maximalism. He's also a theorist, an analyst, and a scholar, and in many of his essays, he has specifically detailed his generative, process-driven compositional approach. So a perfectly accurate performance of his works is not necessarily the intent, although he has expressed in the past that he wants performers to be as accurate as possible. But it can be inferred that through the intricate layers of complexity in Ferneyhough's works, the piece's actualization may be something that the performer cannot completely control with perfect accuracy. As we go through the two example pieces, Piano Quintet and Superscriptio, the differences between the two composers will be thrown into relief, as from visuals alone, it will be very obvious how different their compositional approaches are. Even more so with how they treat odd-factor time signatures. We'll see how Adès expects listeners and performers to, at times, entrain to his music, and he generally uses proportions which he anticipates to be somewhat audibly discernible. Ferneyhough, however, is not as concerned with metric audibility and entrainment when he uses odd-factor time signatures. What I've gathered from his writings is that he sets particular pre-compositional limitations and processes in place, and the surface of the music is the natural outworking of these procedures. So for the first example piece, I would like to specifically focus on some of my research findings for Piano Quintet, the major case study work of Adès, which I've included in chapter 5 of my thesis. It is potentially the pinnacle of Adès's use of odd-factor time signatures by virtue of the frequency and density of the technique, to say nothing of the complexity of the utilization. The notational convention is a solution to challenges which are posed by the particular rhythmic techniques that Adès wants to explore. So effectively, he's attempting to find straightforward notational solutions to communicate these rhythmic challenges. And I do want to highlight, they are supposed to be straightforward notational solutions. Piano Quintet is a 20-minute work, which was premiered in 2001 by the Arditi Quartet, with Adès himself playing the piano. It's set in a relatively transparent sonata form, yet the preoccupation of the work is the subtle relativity of time as experienced through rhythmic distortions and proportional metric relationships. Of primary importance in this intricate work is the focal use of odd-factored time signatures to enact a thorough examination of proportionality. In general, proportionality is the notion of a relationship between two or more things and how they relate to each other in a regular framework. This principle of proportionality in the context of odd-factored time signatures can be defined as the establishment of a regular, consistent pulse stream and contrasting it with another regular pulse stream at a different but related speed. What is being examined is the interaction of rhythmic patterns that are on the surface locally regular, but related by unusual proportional means. And Adès harnesses odd-factor time signatures in such a way that each pulse stream may be perceived as distinct and coherent, but he establishes the relationship between them by superimposition or juxtaposition. And in this way, odd-factor time signatures are used as a method of exploring instrumental independence and interdependence to push the boundaries of chamber ensemble relationships in performance. And this is experienced at the very beginning of the piece. So you'll see here that a 2:3 ratio is established. The conventional denominators are in 4 mostly, and the odd factor denominators are in 6. So you've got this 4:6, or more simplified, a 2:3 ratio, which is established here. And this 2:3 ratio pits the straight crotchet pulse against the triplet crotchet pulse. So looking at the score, let's assume the anacrusis is bar 0. The 4/6 bar here contains 4 triplet crotchets, which is unusual, of course, as that requires an incomplete triplet figure. Adès initially introduces the full triplet figure here in bar 1 before including it in an unconventional form in this 4/6 bar. And Adès maintains this pattern throughout the piece. He introduces tuplet rhythms in conventional time signature bars first, before including them in odd-factored time signature bars. This way, performers are accustomed to the feel of the tuplet in relation to conventional rhythmic figures on a small scale, so within the bar, prior to playing them on a larger scale in incomplete tuplet forms and between bars or instrumental parts.
Excuse me, Justine, it might just be worth pointing out for those who are unfamiliar with the device, the fact that the notes in the 4/6 bar don't look like triplet crotchets.
Yes, and this is part of the notational ambiguity as well. So you can see that here he's got a triplet notation here, but here the denominator is the only thing that implies the tripletness of these crotchets. He hasn't actually specified a triplet bar, triplet notation. He does this in other pieces, and this is what I get into with chapter 2. There are a myriad of different ways in which composers have notated this convention. But for the purposes of this piece and also Superscriptio, they don't actually specify that triplet or tuplet notation.
A further aspect evident here is the technique of phasing between 2 different musical parameters, specifically phasing between rhythm and intervallic contour. The rhythmic pattern has been annotated in the green brackets above the staff, and the intervallic pattern has been demarcated in the purple brackets below the staff. The rhythm is concerned with and created by the alternation of 2 different pulse speeds. In this instance, as I mentioned before, the alternation between the straight and triplet crotchet pulses. So in bars 0 to 3, the rhythmic pattern consists of 6 notes, 2 straight crotchets, 1 straight minim, versus 3 triplet crotchets. In bars 4 to 5, it consists of 8 notes, 3 straight crotchets, 1 straight minim, versus 4 triplet crotchets. In bars 6 to 7, it consists of 5 notes, and so on. So there's an additive subtractive principle to enact changes of proportion, which is further explored with the intervallic pattern. Now, with the intervallic pattern, there is a tonal preoccupation with contrasting whole tone fields. It's characterized initially by 3 notes in a whole tone ascent. So you've got this C, D, E, followed by 4 descending notes belonging to a different whole tone segment, F, E flat, D flat, B. So, of course, there are 7 notes in total in this pattern of contrasting whole tone segments in this opening section. So in bars 0 to 4, due to the rhythmic patterns being 6 notes, there is a 6 to 7 ratio in the phasing of rhythm and melodic intervals. The intervallic pattern begins to alter in bars 4 to 6 with an additional descending note at the end of the phrase, making this intervallic grouping now 8 notes in total. And then bar 6 adds an extra descending note before the ascent, and the intervallic pattern further devolves from there. So although this project is not overtly concerned with non-time related musical parameters, there are clearly independent recurring patterns in other parameters, and as such, proportionality and phasing procedures are evident very early in piano quintet, which become characteristic of the way rhythmic patterns are transformed later in the piece. In the next section, rehearsal mark 1, another important proportion is introduced, the 5 to 8 ratio, as can be seen in the piano line. So the pulse, the value of the pulse in the conventional time signature bars are quavers, hence the 8 denominator in conventional time signature bars. The odd-factored denominators are 5, so you've got this 5-to-8 relationship here. Subtly, a deeper relationship is established between the piano and the first violin. The violin plays a consistent quaver pulse in 4/4 time, while the piano takes on the melody reminiscent of the previous section. However, to add further metric complexity, Adès makes a note for violin 1. From the start of rehearsal mark 1 until rehearsal mark 2, it should treat each new phrase as if it begins on a downbeat. And this effectively nullifies the conventional purpose of time signatures to delineate a hierarchy of beats within a given bar, and instead creates a metric ambiguity to the passage. Therefore, the main accents that the listener presumably perceives are those emphasized in individual parts. Now note the numbers explored thus far in the aforementioned ratios: 2-3 and 5-8. These are all part of the Fibonacci sequence, which bears a strong relationship with the golden ratio, one of the most prevalent proportions in the natural world. 2-3 and 5-8 are two of the most recurring ratios in piano quintet. The other ratio to bridge the gap in the Fibonacci sequence, this ratio 3-5, is introduced in rehearsal mark 2 within the viola part, which takes on the melodic line. So the 3-5 ratio is seen in the alternating blue and green boxes, where triplet rhythms are consistently pitted against quintuplet or quintuplet rhythms. These ratios, based on the Fibonacci sequence, resemble one another quite closely, but are not the same, as can be seen by their decimal representations. And by having the first 3 pages of the score contain these specific ratios, it highlights the intricate nature of the proportional relationships being explored in piano quintet. Rehearsal mark 2 starts to complicate the proportionality, where odd-factored time signatures are not only pitted against conventional time signatures, but where odd prime-numbered tuplets are now pitted against each other. This is the first instance in the piece where there are consecutive bars of odd-factored time signatures that do not share the same denominator, like this 6-5-6 sequence of denominators here. This is also the first time in which the proportionality is felt not just within a single instrumental line, so intra-instrumental proportionality, but between instruments as well, inter-instrumental proportionality. The red boxes indicate the 5-6 and the 6-7 ratios that are not only felt within the piano line, but are also further explored between the piano line and the strings. Rehearsal mark 3 exhibits proportionality at 2 different layers. Firstly, on the bar level, and secondly, in the rhythmic interplay between instruments. Looking at just the time signatures, the strings 4/4 time is played against the piano's 3/5 time signature. So this means that each bar of the piano's line is 3/5 or 60% the duration of a 4/4 bar. So the time signatures alone are then dealing with a 3-5 ratio on the bar level. Although this passage appears complicated, the quintuplets of the strings here actually align with the piano's meter. The strings are actually playing according to a quintuplet quaver pulse. The piano is playing 7 notes to every 6 notes by the strings. Therefore, the inter-instrumental polyrhythm is actualized in a 6-7 proportional relationship. This double layer of proportionality succinctly highlights the rhythmic and metric complexity that is characteristic of piano quintet. From these examples taken from piano quintet, it should be evident that Adès employs odd-factored time signatures to explore the proportional relationships between bars, phrases, instrumental parts, whole sections, even between different musical parameters to enact corollary effects like phasing. Furthermore, this use of odd-factored time signatures challenges performers to individually grapple with the proportionality within their own instrumental parts. And then in ensemble, rehearsal, and performance, players must contend with how their individual proportionalities relate to and affect one another to contribute to a larger scale proportionality. This specific use of odd-factored time signatures is so intricately and complexly utilized in piano quintet, it would be reasonable to assert that performers should regard this piece as a primary work for exploring the depth and pushing the bounds of proportionality in chamber ensemble relationships. Let's now turn our attention to the second example piece, Superscriptio, which I have included in chapter 7 of my thesis. It's a solo piccolo piece written by Ferneyhough in late 1981, 2 decades prior to piano quintet, and is a quarter of the runtime of piano quintet, coming in at just over 5 minutes. So although it's a solo piece and much shorter, Ferneyhough uses time signatures and other time-related notational devices to develop the structure of the work, and therefore the density and intricacy of the notation is evident. Due to the general complexity of Ferneyhough's works, I'm not able to discuss Superscriptio in as much detail as I have with piano quintet, just because Adès' uses of odd-factored time signatures are more visually evident. However, with reference to the preface of Superscriptio, several key conceptions should be discussed to properly contextualize Ferneyhough's approach to odd-factored time signatures. I want to particularly draw your attention to a few significant phrases. The piece is built up of interlocking observations of a dense network of precomposed metric and proportional relationships. This goes back to what I had initially mentioned when I was addressing my methodology. Ferneyhough uses a generative, process-driven method when approaching composition. Ferneyhough views odd-factored time signatures as unusual bar lengths. So he stated in his essay on duration and rhythm as compositional resources that he considers a bar as a space, serving to delimit the field of operations or presence of specific sound qualities. So instead of a bar being used in conjunction with a time signature to show expected metric frameworks of accentuation, periodicity, and pulse speed, Ferneyhough often strips it back to a more fundamental understanding of the bar as a delimited space, a discrete block of time, as it were. And whatever happens within that bar may have little to no reference or even work against the meter which the time signature implies. And this is important to keep in mind as we look at Superscriptio. Texture and momentum are achieved by means of distortion of the complex patterns created by the mobile juxtaposition of odd-factored time signature bars. What does that mean? When I gave the example of the alternating 2/4 and 2/6 bars at the beginning of this seminar, I referenced the concept of distorting the regular metric grid. We'll see in this piece, Ferneyhough changes the time signature almost every single bar, so there is no regular metric grid. Rather, he establishes certain complex patterns, whether they're in the rhythms, phrases, specific melodic contours, etc., just by juxtaposing odd-factored time signature bars, and then he distorts these patterns. Also, the fact that juxtaposition is used is one similarity shared with Adès when he used juxtaposition as a technique to establish proportional relationships in piano quintet. And finally, the gradual desynchronization of bar length gestural shaping and rhythmic density. Now, with this final point of desynchronization, more explanation must be given. Ultimately, in pieces which utilize odd-factored time signatures, Ferneyhough is concerned with the relationship between absolute bar duration and the quantity of discrete impulses in a given time space. So the absolute duration of a bar is how long a bar actually is, and that's often indicated by the combined consideration of both the numerator and denominator of the time signature, because the numerator acts as a multiplier of the duration which is implied by the denominator. The quantity of discrete impulses, or the impulse density, refers to how many pulses are articulated in a bar. Ferneyhough then asks what happens when these two elements are decoupled. So for example, let's say we have a 4/8 bar. The time signature specifies that the absolute duration of the bar is 4 quavers long. The numerator implies that it would be expected that there would be 4 impulses or attacks or pulses in this bar. And then in the bar itself, we see there are actually 4 quavers written. So when we see this bar, there is a 1-to-1 ratio of absolute bar duration and quantity of discrete impulses. But what if both parameters were treated as independent factors? What if they were desynchronized or decoupled? You get something like this. Now notice that the bars cycle between 3 distinct time signatures, 3/8, 4/8, and 5/8. When we're thinking about absolute bar duration in this example, the distinguishing element between these time signatures is the numerator, because the denominators are all the same. They're all 8. Now, with the impulse densities, they cycle between 4 distinct quantities. You've got 4 notes, 5 notes, 6 notes, 7 notes. So in the first bar, there is a 3-to-4 ratio between absolute bar duration and impulse density. In the second bar, there's a 4-to-5 ratio, the third bar 5-to-6, and the fourth bar 6-to-7. In the final 2 bars, the phasing temporarily synchronizes to 4-to-4 and 5-to-5 as the 2 parameters temporarily align. But of course, as the cycle continues, the 2 parameters will later desynchronize and form new ratio relationships. And Ferneyhough exploits the general desynchronization of absolute bar durations and impulse densities in Superscriptio to establish structural patterns, which he then uses to develop the music throughout the piece. So you can see this in the first page of the score. Only 3 of the 24 bars seen here contain corresponding impulse densities to the bar duration, and they're all 1 note in 1 numerator bars. And I've just annotated all of these in pink boxes here. With every other bar, Ferneyhough has specifically divorced the impulse density from the bar duration. So let's just have a look at these annotations in turn. For example, in the red brackets, there are 3 attacks in this first bar, followed by a 3 numerator in the second bar. In the blue brackets, there are 2 attacks in the first bar, followed by a 2 numerator in the second bar. And actually within these first 2 systems, there's a bit of a retrograde effect happening where you've got red bracket, then blue bracket, and then that flips blue bracket, red bracket, with this pink bar in the middle acting as a point of reflection. Within the other 2 pink boxes, there are 2 other annotations. So in the yellow brackets, there are 5 attacks in the first bar, followed by a 5 numerator in the second bar. But I'm going to draw your attention here to this green bracket. So 7 attacks in the first bar, followed by a 7 numerator in the second bar. So that's pretty standard. There's nothing unusual there. But then he keeps going. 10 attacks in the second bar, followed by a 10 denominator in the third bar. So Ferneyhough adds another level to the pattern by involving that odd-factored denominator. He complicates the desynchronization of impulse densities from absolute bar durations by correlating the impulse densities of one bar to the absolute bar duration of the following adjacent bar. Now, I know I've covered quite a lot, but bearing in mind all of these processes taken from the preface, Ferneyhough uses odd-factored time signatures to achieve the following effects in Superscriptio. So exact or similar bar lengths with different time signatures, alternating and retrograde patterns, truncations and elongations, and also other interbar patterns. So I'm going to now discuss a section in the middle of Superscriptio, which synthesizes almost all of these effects. And I'm going to actually look at this section using 3 separate examples just to showcase the complexity and layered intricacy of the pre-compositional procedures employed by Ferneyhough. And I'll just let you have a listen to this before I start talking about the annotations. So the red box annotations highlight an exact repetition of the time signatures that bookend this passage. So you'll see here it's 212, 210, 316, and then that order is repeated, 212, 210, 316. Also within these red boxes, the 210 and 316 bars are of similar duration. So 210 is equivalent to 1.6 quavers in length compared to the 316 bar, which is of course 1.5 quavers in duration. The blue brackets exhibit a retrograde effect with the time signatures. So you've got 1/8 and then 212, and then that's flipped, 212 and 1/8. A final oddity to note is the nested triplet demi-semiquaver circled in pink here. So the nested triplet notation really wouldn't have any effect on the duration of the note, as it is a staccato demi-semiquaver. So the rhythmic notation is likely the result of pre-compositional processes put in place. It may be an indication of some contrapuntal technique occurring, where this particular note is a follow-through of the nested triplet figure in bar 90, or the thick beam could be a continuation of this thick beam here in bar 92. Now, taking a closer look at the first 3 systems of this passage, a different pattern is seen across bars 86 to 91, expressed as 2 groups of 3 bars. So in each group, the numerators are organized in a sequence of 3, 1, 2, that's repeated again, 3, 1, 2. The first 2 denominators of each group have a 2-to-1 ratio. So in the red box, 16 to 8 is at a 2-to-1 ratio. And in the blue box, 20 to 10 is at a 2-to-1 ratio. The last denominator of each 3-bar group is 12. So effectively, the last time signature of each 3-bar group is 212. Finally, there is a retrograde effect of the denominators towards the end of that excerpt in bars 90 to 94, where the denominators are ordered in the sequence of 10, 12, 8, 12, 10. And this is actually seen in later passages. So between the blue brackets here, 10, 12, 8, 12, 10, and then again in this excerpt. So the fact that the exact same 5-bar sequence of denominators is repeated thrice in the work attests to the fact that Ferneyhough's use of pre-compositional processes result in various patterns which affect the structure of the work. Throughout Superscriptio, Ferneyhough has exploited odd-factored time signatures to draw attention to changes in pulse speed, delineate the structure of the work, and create patterns and relationships throughout multiple layers of the music. He's also used odd-factor time signatures to demonstrate the result of the desynchronization of absolute bar durations with impulse densities. These were all executed as part of his generative, process-driven compositional methodology, and his particular use of odd-factor time signatures highlights the deep structural implications of his approach to notation. There are, of course, many more uses of odd-factor time signatures, which cannot be covered in this seminar, but hopefully these examples give a brief insight into some of the potential uses of odd-factor time signatures. As I started my project in 2020, I had originally intended to travel overseas to interview the composers and a few performers, but unfortunately with all the COVID restrictions, I was unable to do so. I think avenues of future study should incorporate these interviews. I approached this project from a purely theoretical and analytical perspective. It would be very insightful to compare my analysis with the composer's original intentions as ascertained through interviews and compositional sketches. Of course, more composers should also be studied. I'm sure that there are other uses of odd-factor time signatures which are not incorporated or employed by either Adès or Ferneyhough. Furthermore, other genres of world music besides contemporary Western art music should be studied with this lens. It's also worth exploring how performers perceive and interact with odd-factor time signatures on a practical level, and how this perception impacts their execution of this notational device. Does an accurate perception affect how audiences receive the music? Or is that not even really perceived by the listener? And would there be a difference between how lay audiences versus musically educated listeners interact with the performance of this notational device? Finally, will odd-factor time signatures be effective in tonal works which adhere to more conventional conceptualizations of meter? And I think this is probably one of the most interesting questions to ask for future research, because throughout this project, odd-factor time signatures have challenged my understanding of meter to include far deeper relationships with rhythm, tempo, bar duration, and periodicity than I had previously assumed. Musical time in post-tonal works is conceived and perceived through the interaction of multiple musical parameters, and I think this is best exemplified through odd-factor time signatures. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions you may have in the comments down below.
Okay, folks, welcome back. We'll move to the question and answer. So the format will be initially the panel plus the external respondent, and then we'll open up to the full seminar.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. I enjoyed that immensely. It was so clear. The didactic elements of the presentation were excellent. And you made especially with the Adès, you made it very clear how the concept works. And I found the discussion of the Ferneyhough to be especially interesting because I don't know much about his concept of time, which was fantastic to learn about. I like this name odd factor. At first I was a little suspicious because the irrational doesn't mean anything.
Yes.
Right? It's useless.
Yeah.
But the way you explained it was convincing.
Okay, cool.
And so I really appreciated that.
Cool. Thank Richard for that.
Okay, thanks, Richard. That was great.
He convinced us, so.
Genuinely irrational time signature would be 2 over pi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I don't have a ton of, well, I don't really have any critical comments because I was just so happy listening to your presentation.
Thank you.
But I did have just a couple of thoughts. The first one was I was wanting to learn more about how your specific research is situated within the broader field, and what sort of original contribution or refinement your work is bringing to what's already been done.
Yeah.
And I imagine you get into that in the thesis.
Yes.
But I didn't really get a sense of it in that.
Yeah. when I did my research, I was looking, I found that a lot of people didn't really explain olfactive time signatures in the nuts and bolts. So actually part of my really unique part of my research is chapter 2. So explaining, I hadn't seen anyone else do this, where they explained the notational ambiguities and the different ways that it was notated. Just exploring it with Adès and Ferneyhough alone, even Adès, how he notates it changes throughout his compositional span. So it was actually really interesting to log that. I think something else as well is a lot of people who talk about it come from a more practical approach. So there are a lot of instrumentalists who will go, look, this is how I practice this because this is really hard otherwise. And to explain and explore it from a top-down approach, which is what Ferneyhough does, compared to more of a bottom-up approach, which Adès does, and how those two different approaches are implemented, how they interact, what are the similarities with those approaches, and obviously what are the vast differences between those approaches. I think it adds a lot to understanding how composers in future will be able to, use this notational device, but also I'm sure that there'll be gaps where they'll be like, okay, well, but you didn't think about this. And so, I think just setting out as many uses as possible seen in those two different approaches gives a more thorough understanding, I think, of the notation. So but that's, good point. I didn't really specify what's different.
I mean, just don't be afraid to, blow your own horn a little bit in the thesis. I'm sure you're getting advice to do that, but just to really make it clear that this is where I'm contributing. I have a couple of other things, but should we keep going? Okay. I was also wondering if you discussed in the thesis how these kinds of devices or these kind of musical time relationships manifest in other musical formats outside of the so-called academic compositional world. So, for example, in flamenco music, there's a lot of what might be seen as irrational or odd-factored time in the relationship between the dance and the singing and the guitar playing.
Right.
Or in conical South Indian music.
Yes, I know. Just because there's so much happening already with the thesis, and it's just that'll just be opening up more cans of worms. Right. So that is definitely part of the limitations of my study. And it would be great to, absolutely. We've had so many conversations around that, but it's just I can't. There's just not enough. There's not enough words here for that. So, that's definitely. I only specifically look at post-tonal, and it's very academic.
And you're specifically in the thesis. You're specifically focusing on Adès and Ferneyhough.
Yes.
Right. So with that in mind, I might suggest to think about reworking the subtitle to make it more specific.
Okay, sure.
Because what's the subtitle? Is that the subtitle of your thesis? What was on the presentation?
Yes. Well, just to I can definitely change it.
It's not a big thing, but just to make it more focused.
That's fair. I try to cover as many as possible, and because they come from two different sides of the spectrum, I was hoping to cover as many uses of odd-factor time signatures as possible. So in that sense, I thought of it generally, but practically, it is. Ultimately, I am just looking at Adès and Ferneyhough. It's something that we've talked about.
Which is totally fine. And it's great to have that focus with the subject. This is challenging. But just a thought you might think about just narrowing that down. And then also in the introductory part of the thesis noting that there are all these other aspects you could go into, but you're focusing. I'm sure you've done that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I'll pass it on.
I'll do a couple things, three things actually. Firstly, thank you for an incredibly clear presentation, really exemplary. And this material is obviously very, very technical, and so it has to be presented with great clarity, and you really did that. I have only really one complaint about the presentation. It was wonderful to hear the Adès. I would love to have heard a little bit of Superscriptio.
Yes.
So if you've got a recording, I'll ask you to play something for everyone here a little later. So that's one thing. A very small critique, and I bring it up because it's really helpful to clarify some of the issues that have to be handled really carefully in this material. But it's in your slide with the proportionality slide, very early in your presentation.
Yep.
In fact, why don't you do the slide, I think it's slide 2, which is the note tree. Yeah, slide 4 there.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is where we have to be so careful about the terminology we use. And the one thing I'm going to complain about here is next to the whole note, the minimum you have beat. I think the word there has to be duration.
Oh, right, sure, yes.
Right?
Yep.
So you have to really be careful about distinguishing between what's a beat or what's a pulse or what's a pulse stream. So another little tiny one is on the proportionality slide.
Yes, okay. Here.
Yeah, okay, so the first little bullet under proportionality with OFTSs, an even pulse contrasted with another even pulse at a different but related speed. You have to be careful about the word even because we're contrasting even and odd.
Oh, yes.
So I wouldn't use the word even there.
Regular.
So you have to say regular or consistent.
Yeah.
And then it's not really a pulse, it's a pulse stream. And the thing is that a pulse stream is 2 or maybe 3 at least of these durations. The pulse is really a duration. And so you should use the word pulse stream there. It gets very convoluted, but we don't really have pulses in this music because they're not consistent. There isn't any regular meter. We can talk about pulse in a Mozart trio because it's always there, or a minuet, but these are always changing, so you have to say pulse stream. So these little technical issues are so profoundly pervasive. I think it would be good to then go to a really simple but telling example because the material gets quickly so interesting and complex. But if you go to your example 2 in Adès with the piano quintet.
No, sorry, just give me a sec. Find it. I'm on example 1 for a very long time, sorry.
Yeah, okay. It's a little hard to see, but there you go, great. Okay, so in the string parts, the middle bar there that's notated in 4/4, but has quintuplet crotchets.
Yes, here. Yep.
Yeah, exactly, right there.
Yep.
Why do you think he notated that in 4/4 and not 5/5, which he could have done? And so this is about the interchangeability of different notations. You can use standard meters and tuplet pulses, or you can use the odd factor time signature is really a tuplet time signature. So why do you think he did that?
Yeah. So something about Adès, which is quite important to note. If he can do it conventionally, he will. That's one of the biggest things about him. So that when he does use odd factor time signatures, it's for very specific reasons. So here, as I mentioned before, there's that 5/8 ratio going on. So that 4 then, so you've got 2/4 and then 4/4, really 6/4, right? In duration. But then this idea of on top of, there's an added level as well of 5 happening. So, yeah, how do I explain this? So instead of, 3/5, 4/5, it could be 5/5, absolutely. And then 4/5, this sense of like adding and then subtracting. So technically speaking, that's what's happening. But I think notationally, he wants to be as simple as possible. So if what's the point of, so unless he's actually doing something very specific with the notation of that odd factor time signature, he's not going to be writing 5-5. But there is actually, there is an additive principle there, 3-5, 4-5, technically 5-5, and then 4-5, and so he's oscillating, which is really cool.
It's almost as though he's making a point here that he could have done it in 5-5, but 4-4 with the tuplets to show what the old way to do it would have been, or something like that. It's like, so it's a really interesting little apocryphal thing.
I think it's actually also for the performer. I mean, in that, like, it's actually at that point, I can't count like 3-5 bars, but I can go and if I'm doing that, and then I've got that little reference point where I can ground that 5 to 8 proportion in meters that I'm comfortable with.
Yep.
Having done that, I can then maybe, extend that to bar durations that are unfamiliar. So if I were the pianist, I would never be playing piano. If I would be counting, I'd be going so I could really nail the 5 to 8 proportion in that bar. So to me, that's a gift for the performer.
And also it makes it apparent as well that this bar duration is actually the same bar duration here. But but if you had written it in 5-5, you wouldn't know it. So these two bar durations are exactly the same, and it actually shows that phasing as well. You can see that this is being displaced by half a bar. So that's really cool. So just through this notation, you actually get to see all these relationships happening at once, and it helps the performers to sync up or not sync up. And, it's really interesting.
I think another question to ask is why wouldn't he notate that bar in 8-8? Because then you would show the 5-8 proportion of the duration of that bar in the next line with the two different speeds of 5.
We have a lot of rabbit hole conversations.
Our supervisor meetings go for very long.
Can I go, but that was a great answer, thank you. Can you just, again, another little thing, but I think it's useful for everybody to understand the density of this. You made this great in Ferneyhough, you were talking about absolute bar duration versus impulse density. This is a really interesting example. So you've got looking along the bottom stratum of annotations numbers, you've got the 3-4 ratio, and then the 4-5 ratio, 4-5 ratio, 5-6, 6-7, and then you go to 1-1 and 1-1 for the other two bars. And you really should call those 4-4 and 5-5.
Okay.
So you don't want to, you have to resist the temptation to reduce the ratio and say, you can't say 4-4 is the same as 1-1, because that's not, then you're not capturing the number of impulses.
I see. Yes.
It's a qualitative difference.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it's just a very small point, but we're so used to saying, I can notate that as a 2-4 bar, or as a, so it's kind of from that same way of thinking. So just watch for that. But if you go back to this slide that had the right there, this preface is so interesting, and you were talking in an earlier one, you underlined the unusual bar length element. I think that's really fundamental to both composers, but even more so with Ferneyhough, where he's really telling you that he's taking these time spans that are in a wide range of geometric relationships to one another. I'm calling it geometric because it's the geometry of the time signatures relative to one another. And then he's filling those in some other way, which isn't necessary, and you make that point really well. So it's fascinating to think about that as being completely different than notions of traditional meter in a Mozart minuet, or even a piece by Elliott Gyger. What to the degree that he uses traditional meter?
Because at certain points he's effectively ungrading. It's ungraded densities.
Yes.
Something like that.
Whereas in Adès, how would you describe in this particular connection that the difference in Adès is, I'm going to call it musicality, because it's a really different approach to time and rhythm compared to Ferneyhoug's.
Yeah, we talked about, in a way, like especially in piano quintet, for example, there's a sort of like organic feel where it just kind of, he starts, if I go back, I have to go back like a billion years. Okay, yeah, here. Okay, so, so this idea of opening it up in this way, and then he just keeps expanding it and then just distorting and changing, and just this very organic, gradual progression that unfolds the music in a very, like, it's quite a natural way, I think, which most people are accustomed to. And then what was the other point that you just asked me?
Well, comparing that with Ferneyhough.
Ferneyhough is very, he's like, he does not think about the surface, the musical surface from the outset. Actually, with Superscriptio, it's fascinating. He specified numerators in the time signature from only 1 to 11. No, that can't be right. Yes, no, yeah, that's right. 1 to 11, 1 to 11 with numerators that are only odd numbers. And if he uses 2 or 4, it's for very specific reasons. And then only denominators from 8 to 48 that are in triplet and quintuplet relationship. And it's just so interesting. And so he's like, okay, and with this, and with these limited materials, I'm going to then start structuring things and then start putting in the musical surface. And it's just so interesting. Like, that's just so different from how other composers who are not top down would approach composition. So with piano quintet, it's actually really easy. It's kind of didactic in a sense, how he approaches, how Adès approaches the music compared to how Ferneyhough approaches the music. And yeah.
Great answer. Could you play this passage again a little bit for everybody? It's very easy to remember. I find it sticks, but play it again anyways. And then maybe play a little bit from Superscriptio so people can hear the... I
don't have Superscriptio, unfortunately.
Okay.
It was, I did not have enough time to actually find that part. But did you want me to play this again? Yeah.
Sure.
So you can hear that elongation, shortened, elongated, and then he starts drifting off. It's really cool, actually. Like, it's just, you can hear that elongation and truncation happening. Yeah.
One of the things I find fascinating about this piece, and we've talked about this in the past, so it's not news, but in some respects, it's very 19th century in character. It feels like a piece of late 19th century chamber music, despite the fact that the notes are more complex than that and that the metrical scheme is different. But one thing that I sometimes find frustrating is, can I really actually hear the difference between the 6 and the 8 when my idea goes from 2/6 to 3/8? Is it getting smooshed out? And I think, so would I be complaining if I were listening to Brahms and all the quavers in the bar were the same length? And the answer is I wouldn't. There's this really interesting dialectic, particularly in this piece, which to me is deeply in dialogue with 19th century chamber music style and vocabulary, but also performance practice. It's like, you don't expect it to be rigid and metronomic. The piece is fluid, it's organic. That doesn't mean that the proportions don't matter. They matter just as much as Henny Older's doing Brahms, but a Henny Older in Brahms doesn't mean that the crotchets are exactly 2/3 the length of the dotted crotchets necessarily. We understand them that way, and the performers have to learn them that way, but it's not like it has to literally be those proportions on the surface, if you go down to micro timings in the recording. So that's a really sort of interesting thing. I had one little thing, fabulous presentation just then. It's all, we've talked through a lot of these things before, so there's nothing much there that's new. One little correction, which is around the absolute bar duration thing, which isn't solely a factor of the numerator, of course. The denominator's involved as well.
Yes.
In the example, the sort of didactic example there, it equates to the numerator because the examples are 3, 8, 4, 8, and 5, 8,
Yes.
and the denominator is the same. But that 2, 4 bar could equally be a 4, 8 bar or a 1, 2 bar.
Yes.
So it's not a factor only of the numerator, it's actually the numerator as a multiplier of the duration implied by the denominator. So that's a little bit more complicated. And the other thing is, I think I might have solved the mystery of that demi-semi-quaver triplet.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, so the thing that I suddenly noticed is, where is that hanging beam coming from leading into that note? And so I thought,
Oh, there.
so actually not there, it goes back I think even further to like,
There?
to the various other places where there are triplet, where the same sort of durational values occur. Actually, I think the link is actually, it doesn't have a hanging beam of it, but it's in bar 90. We've got the same, we've got what I'm getting at is I think it's an indicator of counterpoint, of picking up an earlier sort of like strand of musical discourse. It's not super clear, I will grant you that, but I think that might be, that there might be a clue there that duration connects with other notes notated with the same duration earlier on.
I have a feeling, though, it could be this one, though, because you've got that 9A.
It could be, yeah.
And then this is what I had to grapple with for 4 years.
So in fact, if you like that, at the beginning of 94, what you've got is a 210 bar
Yep.
with a doubly nested triplet demi-semiquaver.
Yep.
If you go right above it, there's a 110 bar, and the second last note of the bar is a doubly nested triplet demi-semiquaver also.
Yep.
So those two notes are in fact exactly the same theoretical duration. So I'm just wondering if on occasion when you find a little notational sort of like peculiarity like that, if in some cases at least it might be making a connection to something else, and the hanging beam was the
clue.
Was the clue. Yeah.
Actually, just back on the point as well, just before what you mentioned, I think that is a difference with Adès and Ferneyhough as well. What were we just talking about?
About the performance realization.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
In multiple of Ferneyhough's works, which have odd factor time signatures, he specifically says, do not, don't ritardando, do not accelerando, don't rubato. This has to be exact. And you have to be exactly playing this, and like, because those proportions and those speed changes have already been implemented in the time signature. What's fascinating about Adès, actually in Piano Quintet, there's actually a section where it goes accelerando and everyone does their own thing, despite the odd factor time signatures happening at once. So at that point, you can't really hear those proportions anymore, and it just becomes an absolute like crazy mess of sound. And it's just like, oh, that's really interesting to think about rubato being placed on odd factor time signatures, because then that necessitates rubato, as Richard had pointed out in one of the supervisor meetings, rubato necessitates meter. It necessitates entrainment. It necessitates this feeling of like, I can project forward. So this idea that Adès is also using rubato is fascinating, which means that there is metrical sensation in Adès compared to maybe how Ferneyhough sees it.
I don't remember if we've ever discussed, there is this absolutely loopy piece by Percy Granger called something like Boyi Sun or something like that, which is, it's written with like insane complex changing time signatures, not odd factored, I don't think, just that like, 532 and 764. But what he's doing is actually strictly notating rubato. It's actually a very beautiful, quite ordinary tonal or modal folk song kind of melody, and he's notated it in an absurdly complex way in order to get at what would happen if you tried to quantify rubato. It's absolutely fascinating. Does anyone know the piece anyone come across the piece that I'm talking about? Yeah. It's. I think it's called something like boat song or sailor song or something.
And that's the notational maximalism that
Yeah.
I was talking about with Ferneyhough as well. Like this just absolute control.
Another interesting thing about that, I was watching a beautiful video of Adès playing piano, wonderful piano player, and he and another piano player were playing one of Nancarrow's, a transcription of one of Nancarrow's piano reels. One of these ones where if you were to transcribe it, you'd have, I think Nancarrow himself actually wrote it out as one line is playing in 4/8, the other line is playing in 5/8, and the top line is playing in 3/4.
Right.
And he and this other piano were playing, the piano player were playing it, but he was doing all of these expressive nuances.
Yes.
Slight retardando, and it was just beautiful the way he played it. He really brought it to life. It was very un-machine-like.
Yeah, awesome.
So obviously that's an aesthetic that he appreciates.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, cool. Sorry, that went very long. Is that?
Should we open up questions to the
Oh,
panel?
and maybe Linda as well?
Yeah, to Linda, do you want to unmute if you have any questions?
First of all, well done. Fantastic presentation, as has been commented by others, and doubly well done on the reshaping of the project. To have to reconceptualize such a massive undertaking. I know you weren't the only one in this boat, but everyone who was in that particular boat starting their PhD at that particular moment in history, phenomenal challenge. So, and possibly even if you had been able to trek off and do interviews and attend performances, you might have had to have jettisoned quite a lot of material, because I can imagine that you might have actually really got into the guts of what you presented here and run out of space. But anyway, at the very outset, when you were introducing your two key subjects, you noted that Brian reacted with chagrin at the moniker of the father of new complexity. Could you please expand upon why he was so kind of modest about, or whatever reaction that he had to that descriptor?
So it was just really funny. Several people have called him father of new complexity, and he just hates it because I don't think he particularly likes the idea of being labeled as a modernist. I don't think he particularly, from what he said, he doesn't really, he doesn't particularly align with those views, despite the fact that I think objectively speaking, the majority of people would be like, no, this is very modernist. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like to be affiliated with, what's it called? I don't know. She just doesn't like being affiliated with modernism. So yeah, I don't know. It's just, that is his preference, and good on him. I'm just going to mute myself again so that Nick can unmute, and we can hear.
Right. Thanks again for the choreography. Yes, fair enough. Most true artists don't like to be put into a box and carry a label. They want to be unlabelable, of course. Yes, so that's fair enough. Had you been, or if you were wanting to pursue other composers, an Australian composer that pops to mind immediately is Chris Dench. And he, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but I happened to be supervising his PhD about 25 years ago in composition, and he certainly reveres Ferneyhough's work and has many interesting numbers for time signatures all over his own compositions. And of course, there's Lisa Lim, who would be an interesting adjunct to the focus might be how the time signatures interrelate with texture, because she's such a textural based, or texture is such an important component of what she does. And just as a side note, isn't it amazing about her ARC fellowship, my golly? Yeah, good on the University of Sydney, but that's a very side note. And one last question I have for you. Have you looked at any of the reception in the ephemeral press, or any sort of where to these two composers, any reviews of concerts or of recordings or so on, and to what extent do the reviewers get what the composers are doing? Yeah, so that's all I wanted to ask. Back to you.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I did. I have read several reviews and articles. The most, okay, so all Ferneyhough's ones are like no, but with the most accurate review, which has been the most like aware of what he was doing, was for Piano Quintet, and I can't remember who wrote it. I do reference it in my thesis. But it is interesting. She does specifically, the interviewer specifically states, so this is about proportionality. This is about how the players interact and relate to one another. And it's just, yeah. And he was like, yep. And so that was that. I think by far that was the most aware review. Apart from that, no, not really. I think just because Adès sounds so, a lot of the things that he writes just sound so beautiful, like beautifully natural, like Piano Quintet, that they don't really focus on the notation. With the reviews, it's more about, how does it sound? How does the group work and stuff like that? It's just not, it's not about the notation. So yeah. Cool.
So possibly.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's Linda.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So just a quick response. Possibly it ironic that the conception of the Adès is kind of more traditional than the Ferneyhough, even though they're so far apart in the examples that you gave. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Justine. Well done again.
I think we have time for a couple of seminar questions. Yeah, Boyi?
Hi, Justin. That was a great presentation.
Would you mind just speaking loud so that the mic picks it up?
Oh, maybe I just started.
Yeah.
So my question is, well, in the first example of
Yes.
your Adès piece, you have a 4/6 bar. I'm just wondering, since it's right. So since this 4/6, this duration has appeared previously as in the form of triplet, and there are all of most of bars in the, at least in the first sequence, are written with the denominator of 4. Do you think, or have you seen it written as a time signature with a normal kind of denominators such as 4 in the denominator and a factor fraction in the numerator, like 2/3?
Oh yes, I have actually. I've seen stuff like that. With this one, okay, so yes, so Brahms, was it Brahms? I can't remember. There's a composer. I talk about this in chapter 1. He uses
distraction.
Bourles, yes, Bourles, that's it.
In the natural sonnet, there's like 1 2/3 4. And
Yes,
like
yes. So yes, that is a way to think about it, right? So this would, I mean, this is 2/3. So this is 2/3. Wait, is it 2/3 4? No. What would this be? Yes. Yeah, well done. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, so 2 2/3 4, 2 2/3 over 4 in like conventional notation. Absolutely. That has been happened. That is a precursor to this odd factored time signature. The odd factored time signatures, I'm specifically dealing with integers. Just to simplify that, because that way of 2 2/3 over 4 deals with the bar duration, which is what Ferneyhough does, but this also specifies how many articulated pulses, and it also specifies the value of this note. Does that make any sense? Whereas 2 2/3 only specifies the bar duration. So yeah, and that's why I think the odd factor time signatures are even more versatile. Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you for the question. That was awesome.
There's also, by the way, there's a notational device that Karl Orff uses for time signatures, which is
4 over semi-breve.
Right, 4 over semi-breve. Well, one of the great advantages is that you can write compound time and write 4 over dotted crotchet rather than 12/8. And actually, I don't know of anyone who's done that with odd factors, but there's no reason why you couldn't have 7/triplet crotchet or something like that. It would be perfectly usable.
And with that, so the denominator of 9 is either a 9/8 ratio, so it'd be non-uplet quavers, or it's a 9/4 ratio, which are nested triplet crotchets. Is that right? So, and this is what I talk about with chapter 2. The problem is these denominators present ambiguities into what those note values are. If odd factor time signatures were redone in Orff fashion, you could then specify, okay, it's 4 non-uplet quavers versus 4 triplet crotchets or whatever, I think that, yeah, that would be clearer. And we wouldn't be having so much issues with notational ambiguities with some of the nested numbers. Yeah.
Could I ask a quick question about kind of the overall meaning or import of this kind of analysis? So, it's really beautifully presented, really clear. But I guess, do you see your work as engaging with debates about difficulty or complexity, or sort of that larger kind of post-war contemporary context in which composers are sort of creating these complicated games? I was just thinking, there's a beautiful quote from an experimental author who's worked with the Collège de Pataphysique, which is the College of Pataphysics, which is a kind of absurdist, modernist science of imaginary solutions.
Right. Okay.
Who says that the point of art, and he was an author writing about literary experiments, is to, for us to sort of, we're kind of like the rats who are creating labyrinths in which we can sort of make our way through them.
Right.
And I guess what I hear, especially with the Ferneyhough, is that these are like, it's a very specific kind of game or set of structures or set of sort of complexities that aren't reducible to, for example, performance practice or how performers are going to interpret it, but rather there's something more to it. I guess, do you see or do you have thoughts on how sort of your work engages with sort of the why, like why composers are doing this, or that larger sort of huge debate, not a huge debate about sort of difficulty and complexity and sort of elitism or any other kinds of ways that people have sort of approached or thought about this kind of music.
Yeah, well, Ferneyhough definitely is on the elitist end. This is what's so interesting about comparing Adès to Ferneyhough. So, as I mentioned with Piano Quintet, the reason he's notated it like that is to make it easier for the performers to engage and perform this music. Because he tries for the simplest notation every time. So, and he's decided that this odd factor time signature notation is the simplest to convey what he wants to convey here. With Ferneyhough, you know, I think his is more to do with like compositional process. What does he want to get? What does he want to get out of it? And like the listener kind of be damned sort of thing of what am I trying to convey here? What am I trying to express here? Compared to, and I think there's far more of a relationship between the composer, performer, and listener with Adès compared to Ferneyhough. Ferneyhough's very specifically like, no, I'm writing this because I want to write under these particular limitations. I want to test myself. I want to push the boundaries of what I want to express. That's how I see it. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's correct or accurate, but that's certainly, yeah. And I think with the why, I think it's all reasons in between, I think, with that. I think relationships is so important. So not only the ratio proportional relationships, but the interrelationships of people who are experiencing this, whether it's composer to performer, performer to listener, or composer to listener even, going through that chain. And how do you express ideas and communicate musical concepts in a way that is easy or difficult? I think a lot of it poses a lot of questions about barriers to communication. And I do think that that's really interesting. I'm not sure that's fundamentally the purpose of it or the why, but that's something that has certainly been so interesting to grapple with as I've been doing the project. Because Ferneyhough certainly frustrates comprehension in a lot of ways. And whereas Adès seems to break down a lot of barriers to communication and understanding. So I think that's really interesting, but like those two different approaches. I don't know if that answered the question.
Thanks for taking a huge sort of question and answering it so beautifully.
Might be worth mentioning also that Piano Quintet is, with the possible exception of a very recent Adès piece that I had a chance to go in detail, as you mentioned earlier, is like the peak of complexity of the technique, and in some ways Adès then sort of receded from that. But there are also, so for example, one of the pieces which features odd-factored time signatures quite prominently is an early orchestral work called Asila, particularly in a passage which is actually based on a rave nightclub sort of feel, and basically you've got this thumping like bass beat that every so often has a 2/6 like throw or a 1/6 thrown in there to disrupt it. So you go so directly engaging with that whole sort of like elitism question, high art, low art thing is actually very much to the fore, and that's not typical necessarily for Adès, but it's part of where he's coming from. You can't ever imagine Ferneyhough doing anything like that, I don't think. But a lot of the other examples of Adès using the technique are actually quite straightforward, I suppose, in that sense.
I wonder if that's good place to leave it and congratulate Justine on a beautifully presented presentation and expertly navigated Q&A.
Thank you very much.